This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, where in anticipation of 9/11, which is not only the date of the alleged terrorist attack on the United States, but also on the date on which Paul McCartney may have died in an automobile accident, it's my pleasure to feature again Clare Kuehn to talk about a subject she has researched extensively, where she maintains a website on this question, and where it's really quite a most interesting issue once you get into the wide range of evidence that tends to support her thesis. Clare, welcome back to the show.
Hi, Jim. Yes, happy anniversary of all kinds of things. No, anyway, morbid remembrance of 9/11, 2001, and of possibly 1966, Paul's death.
Clare, how did you first get involved in, become interested in this question? I mean, it's a fairly esoteric subject, and while some have expended a great deal of effort on it, as you have, it's fairly unusual. So tell us about how you became interested in this.
I actually became interested in it as a debunking project. Not avidly, hatefully to debunk it. I wasn't angry at those that might have said that this was true. I just assumed fairly flippantly that it must be people who are just not careful with their visual perceptions, with their the way they interpret symbolic items, so that they end up creating a myth, creating a hoax, creating a rumor, creating an idea. And that is actually the commonest accusation levied against people who take this on and not only treat it seriously, but come to treat it as really quite true, is that they must be, drug-addled weirdos who made it up in the 60s, or that they're just uncareful thinkers. They don't know how to understand evidence and that sort of thing. So I set out to actually use it as a counterpoint to our general work on 9/11, on Kennedy, on, a number of other topics as well that I won't go into. And I actually discovered it was an extensive circumstantial case. It made me think about what a circumstantial case is, what evidence is, before you've made a decision whether the evidence is truly valid. You call it evidence in a court, it's anything on the table, and what kinds of things they were marshaling, and there was quite a range of them, and they were constant things that came up in Beatles references, and then there were gaps in the history and all kinds of things. So that was part of it. And the other thing was I saw it. I could see it. I could see the difference, and it shocked me. And then I thought, well, maybe I'm wrong, right? Now that I think I've seen a difference, maybe it's just camera, lighting, all the things that people very quickly want to explain this away as. And I got really good at seeing, he's always a bit like this after 67, and he's always a bit like that before 67. It's a different guy. But it is a hard thing for some people to take the differences that they notice and treat them seriously enough to say that is not a camera angle merely, that is not an isolated photo, that's not an isolated problem in the way the songs were written. No, it's a different guy. So it does help that I can actually differentiate these people, but it also I started it as a debunking project. Like I just assumed this was a weird one. This one would be pretty easy. This would be like unicorns. This is going to fall apart fairly quickly, and it will make a wonderful case study to show all the rest of us serious conspiracy cover-up aware people, how good our other work is. And I realized, no, it's true. He died, and there were very good reasons that he died, and that was really quite a shocker to me. So that's how I actually got into it, was to disprove it scientifically reasonably, right? To say, what ways can this be shown to be very flimsy? What ways can I poke holes in it?
Tell me, what were some of those differences that you noticed when you started to take this question seriously between the the earlier and the later Paul McCartney?
Well, it's a little hard to put in words. There are some very good comparative, isolated examples out there. And I've actually got to rewrite my blog page so that I can put in some more of them. The argument is when you really notice a difference, and there are some comps where you think, gosh, that really does not look like the same guy. You have to be careful because, of course, many times somebody can be caught in a strange position or a weird camera angle. We've all had a mugshot for a passport photo that didn't, sort of on a superficial look like us. But when you convert, if you're able to convert in your head and get a real good sense of all kinds of images of a person, and I'm very good at that, and then excuse me, there's a truck going by, then to turn around and say, can all of those differences, do I see them fairly consistently? Or can that come from the same head? Is that just a lighting change? You find that in this case, you can't go back. But many people don't go that far or are not that good with visual impressions. They take the first, sort of looks like him, sort of doesn't, kind of looks like him, gosh, that looks like... But that's not really what you have to do. You have to say, what if this were really true? What if this were really true and I really had to see the trick? And that's what I'd actually like to start with today. Is, okay, what if everybody came out on the stage? Everybody's left. So you've got Jane Asher, the ex-girlfriend of Paul McCartney, and I mean both Paul McCartneys, okay? She actually did date the second one as well. So let's take this as true for the moment, and I'm going to use the language of Paul's really being dead. So Jane Asher, having dated both of them, kept quiet since then. Frida Kelly, who was the fan club secretary all those years, who has kept quiet about this if it had happened. George Martin, the producer, who's very old now, coming out, and Sir Paul McCartney coming out, and Ringo Starr, and other people coming out and saying, by the way, we're about to die. We're getting really old now. We'd like to tell you, he did die. We are ashamed of it, but we thought that it would allow this band to continue, and there were pressures, and yeah, it was a bit selfish, but here's where he's buried, or he was cremated on this date. Here's the paperwork. Now, it's not likely in a cover-up, if it's a real cover-up for anybody to come out like that. Okay, you know that. But what if that kind of thing occurred tomorrow? People would have to scramble to say, what did I miss? So let's take a look at the material that is out there and say, all right, this is the kind of thing you would then go and fish through. And let's see if it's sort of solid. It has pieces in all areas that would be needed for this to have occurred. For instance, there's a gap here, so there's no alibi. There's references there, so that's that kind of information. There's, this sort of indication of feelings, how people felt. That kind of, all of those things would have to be there if it were real. There would have to be a little bit of stuff in every area of inquiry. And that is, in fact, what we find. So perhaps if people take that approach, assume the end, go back and say, how strong is this if I assume that end, right? Is there stuff everywhere that I would expect to find it? And are there details I would notice in that stuff because now I'm sympathetic to it, right? Details that actually make it stronger as a case, stronger as a possibility. So you can always go back and say, nah, I still don't want to believe it. But from the point of view of what if somebody came out on a podium tomorrow or whatever, all right, what kinds of things would you then go back and say, this was here all along? Okay, that's a little bit more sympathetic than most people take cases that they find very controversial or very upsetting or very ugly or very stupid, right? They don't tend to do that. So, like, if you do that with a unicorn or the flat earth, they fall apart fairly quickly. Now, there are cases you can make. You can marshal evidence for unicorns. You can marshal evidence for a flat earth, and then people do. But they fall apart fairly quickly, and there isn't stuff in every area you would need to have it, right? They're fairly spotty. Okay, but this is not the case here. There are some gaps, but they're in reasonable places. They're exactly where in a cover-up that would be likely to happen, right? But there's a lot of other information around them. Does that make sense to you? So
yes, it does. Yes, it does.
If everybody just says, all right, okay, I'll give over, right? No, really give over. What if you missed something about that face, body, mannerisms, manner of speaking, manner of singing, manner of moving in Paul after 67, Paul II after 67? You have to begin talking to yourself that way. Now, you have to actually say, what if this were true? How strong is the case? What would I have found? And are there significant, slightly shocking details which, if I'm slightly amenable to the idea, I will allow myself to be shocked by it? Gosh, that is very detailed. That is very intertwined. That is, boy, that's exact. Boy, that keeps cropping up. That's how a cop would do it. That's how a person who's been tricked by a magic trick would have to do it. Gee, yeah, I guess I sort of did see something over there. I mean, I wasn't sure, but you're kind of right. Maybe it was a trick, but maybe not. So, you allow yourself to be a little surprised. You can always go back at the end, dear jury, and say you disagree. But let's go through it as if, for the moment, you're totally unprejudiced. You've never seen McCartney and McCartney before. You haven't heard their music. You are hearing the kinds of things about the argument that you would have to learn to understand that argument. That's the only way to do it. You have to kind of wipe your mind, or else it will be a prejudiced decision. And that's the hardest thing. That's what I did. I said, all right, let's look at this for real, as if it were true. And I said, oh my goodness, this is extensive.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating, Claire. You've alluded to major areas of, different forms or types of evidence. I presume the most obvious would be, as it were, forensic issues about height, weight, teeth, face, facing of eyes, ears, that sort of thing. That would be one area.
Voice and movement, and we don't really have handwriting samples that are clear.
Well, I was getting to that in terms of behavioral, right? You have the voices.
Behavioral is actually one of the easiest ways to begin to notice it. It is not, of course, yes, you're saying there's all these forensic or more direct aspects about the case or the argument that people could notice. And there's a huge circumstantial case. When I say circumstantial, I don't mean that lightly. I mean that everything else in the storyline, if it were true, everything else in the argument. By the way, one of the first things that people do, and I've noticed this about this case and every other case where people resist it, it could be the Boston bombing, it could be whatever, is, you're making up this story, if you tell, that's what the mind is, that's what an argument does. You are making up, in a strong sense, you are actually showing connections that you think are there, right, between items out in the real world that you think are significant. And therefore, it is a storyline, a fiction. That doesn't mean untruth. It means a storyline of arguing and of what may have happened or why it may have happened. That's what an argument is, And the evidence can be anything from blue moons and green cheese to dead body tissue. You can marshal anything, and there are lots of people who say all you've done for any of these controversial cases, right? All you've done is you just pulled stuff, and you're interpreting it. And, you interpret it because it's important, and that's part of what you do. Then you judge the interpretation, and you judge the evidence marshaled. But it's not bad to be making a storyline, making an argument, and pulling things together. So that's my first, if you will, point about any controversial subject. Some of the listeners have a major reaction to this case. We've seen it before. Some won't have heard of it, some and so on. But this issue is actually the most controversial and least believed of all the major conspiracy issues out there. A recent Rasmussen poll said 3% of Americans believe this. Another 15 think it's possible. So that's 18% are somewhat warm to the idea that it's the lowest combined, right? And it's certainly the lowest belief factor. Yet, if it were true, it is one of the most important things to get straight in your mind. Why? Because it's very personal perception issue. It shows how we are tricked and how careful we must be, how utterly rigorously careful we must be to understand we can be wrong about something. It makes a very good point. You might be wrong. Now, not everything adds up to really being wrong, but it's a very intense. It's like saying your grandmother is a hat. No, she isn't. Well, what if you have a mental disease and you didn't know it and you thought she would? There are people with that problem. Or what if someone switched her and killed her and put a hat in her? Whatever. You know, a child might say, where's my Grammy? She's now a hat. What they mean is there's a hat where the grandmother was sitting. And, you know, the point is you have to be very careful when you say something just isn't true. That's the first thing that this is important about. The second thing is music industry corruption and the entire aspect of takeover. I mean, it was never perfect, but of a kind of a takeover through military, intel, especially in the 60s, moving forward. This is a huge issue. It has been attacked in different ways, right? Different aspects. And the main person who's written about this is very, well, in one of his posts, is a little bit upset at me for linking his work with this because he hasn't gotten into this himself so much. And that's Dave McGowan. And I'm an immense fan of what Dave has done in his work on serial killers, and there's a lot of them linked to military and other cults and all that stuff and mind control and so on. But also through the music industry, that there were fake bands with fake musicians and real musicians who were fakely put together in the early 60s as a deflectionary tactic. It was children of military intelligence, people who had been in military intelligence and in aerospace and in pharmacological bio research and who just happened to be in Cuba or wherever just at the time where there was a coup and all this stuff. Those people and their kids suddenly flocked to an area where there was no music industry in Laurel Canyon, L.A. in the very early 60s through the mid-60s and start producing music when there's not even clubs for them to play in, okay? And so he has traced the incipient, what we think of as peace, love, drugs, 60s scene. He's traced it as an op. But not a perfect op. Not everybody works 9 to 5 and so on. Some these people really were trying to make a go of it too. There were crimes all around this. There were pedophiles. There was murders. There were, all kinds of things. A lot of drug stuff. And then to vilify it with the Altamont murders and the Manson stuff, so that it creates make people who might be anti-war or young, make them deflect onto drugs and do a mind control experiment also by promoting all kinds of LSD in various ways at concerts and in talking about it. And then by the end of the 60s, bust them with violence and make it look as if they too are violent. And this is an operation to, in a way, deflect normal anti-war sentiment. Now, it had a good effect where some people became more, loving or brought forward some of the ideals of that era. But in terms of, at the time, it was deflectionary. There weren't a lot of people commenting on the war and stuff among these major bands, the Doors and Mamas and the Papas and Beach Boys. They were not activists. And when you start realizing this, it's very hard to find one of those major people, their backers, their supporters, or themselves, who isn't seemingly or directly connected to military and intelligence and some kind of mind control, or was in a strange place at a strange time, or is big money, big money people, big families, lots of suicides, and their wife is in the CIA, whatever. When you realize this, you go, wait a effing minute. So his work gives a context. If that's going on in the U.S., and if in London there's something similar, and it turns out it was around the Indica book scene and the International Times magazine, which promoted a brand of Satanism, Illuminism, those words, oh my gosh. But what they are is they're forms of occultic belief combined with justifications for the will, that the will runs everything, our will, our appetite, our greed, things are okay. So it allows for hedonism and a little more looseness than traditional religions allow, and maybe that's a good thing, okay? But on the other hand, it also allows a lot of seedy behavior and even outright criminal behavior to flourish. So there is a kind of a loving of not just personal S&M behavior, but S&M attitude to the world, okay? And so London had its own version of this, and the people founding it were children of ambassadors to Mexico. They were people who were, very connected. And they start off promoting these things, and one of them was Barry Miles. And he is the most quoted biographer by Dave McGowan. He's one of the guys who's telling the story of the Laurel Canyon bands and of people in London. And he leaves stuff out, but he does mention certain things. He's the official biographer of Sir Paul McCartney, good friends. And my point is, who would be the group that if all of this stuff is going on to deflect and experiment with the public, who would be the group that would need to be or would be the creme de la creme to infiltrate, use their name if you're going to do operations, pass information or promote LSD at concerts? It would be the Beatles. That would be your prime target. They were a bunch of friends. They weren't really corruptible beyond girls and drugs, right? They were not. They were a band of brothers. They were out there having fun, young guys. Whom would you want your intel asset, culty interested guy to be part of? And the indication is that Sir Paul McCartney, for all of the lovely things he promoted and believed in, was a little bit like some of these Laurel Canyon bands in the U.S., a double agent. Not only living as a double, as Sir Paul, for Paul, but also a double agent, that he was doing other things with his power and into that. Now, this is a larger picture even than many people want to take the argument about, did Paul die? Can I see it? This is ridiculous. Oh, it started in the late 60s. Oh, it's a ridiculous hoax. This actually gives a context that doesn't prove it happened, but it gives a huge motivation to promote, to give the idea to the band or to Brian Epstein, their manager, to have a man come in. They probably wouldn't have thought of it themselves. It gives an entire rationale. If this happened, there is a huge motive to make it happen, to protect the guy and use him, and even possibly to cause the death. And that's the ugliest direct side of it all. And that's, what I'm trying to do is show that evidence for the death aside, the more you know about the scenes, the more you say, oh, I better look carefully here. This is not necessarily just an issue of perception. And because you asked how I came to this, I'd already
Claire, this is marvelous. We have to take our first break. This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, with my very special guest today, Clare Kuehn, discussing the hypothesis many find difficult to imagine that Paul McCartney died in 1966 and was replaced by another man very like him. We'll be right back. This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, continuing my conversation with Clare Kuehn. Clare, if I understand part of what you're saying is you're suggesting that with a strong anti-war movement evolving in relation to Vietnam in particular, because of the draft primarily, which Nixon, basically deflated by abolishing the draft, which I think actually turns out to have been a historic blunder for the United States because it meant that the parents of children were no longer concerned about or as concerned about decisions of war and peace because they knew there was a volunteer army and that their sons or daughters were most unlikely to be affected. You're suggesting, I take it, that since there is a massive military-industrial complex that makes its profits off of war, that they would have an interest in defeating or diffusing or discrediting an anti-war movement. And therefore, they proceeded to infiltrate the anti-war movement and to promote recreational use of drugs, for example, that might ultimately have the effect of creating a diversion so that instead of having an active, articulate anti-war movement, there are a lot of, hippies smoking pot and getting laid. Am I roughly right?
Yes, that early on, and there's evidence that they knew roughly the casualties that were going to come out of such a war, that various elements, and again, this is not saying that people often get, in all of these conspiracies of big nature, not just two people robbing a grocery store, but big conspiracies, there's often the claim it's too big, it can't work, or it's too small, too narrow. You're just saying it's like four people who organize the whole world. Actually, both are a little bit true, and there goes a black beetle, VW beetle, driving by. I tell you, whenever I discuss this topic, I swear there's a beetle that drives by. You want to see it as magical, spiritual, whatever. I get them. Anyway, so that was a little diversion. But what I was going to say is it's a deflectionary, diversionary tactic. It also would be over-determinedly likely to happen around that period anyway, because, as you know, there are cultic interests like gangland. Gangland groups tend to like special propitious days for doing their actions. They tend to be very superstitious, magical thinking, right, that if they do this, this will make this happen. And so they also can be very involved with cult-like activities, actual cult activities, occultic beliefs, some of them not so nice, some of them kind of innocent, right? Lighting a candle to maybe make your black beetle show up on your street, right, when I'm talking to Jim Fetzer, might be rather innocent. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, right? It's a form of wishful thinking, and maybe there's something to it. I didn't light a candle, by the way. I didn't make that happen. But some of it's quite a bit more nefarious. So cultic intel linking to all sorts of characters, money, and people having discussions at banking dinner tables and so on, right? There's all kinds of people who are pushing for things. Some of them have more power to make something divert, deflect with their money, to make a phone call, make somebody be assassinated, and so on. Some of them have less of that power, but they are different sorts of, again, they're against us. So in that sense, they're not good for us, right? But they're not all one group. They're not all one. So at that point, you had already had at least 20 years of mind control experiments. You'd had drugs developed for spy usages. You'd had experiments we now know on prison and prostitutes, unwilling, unwitting. You had some of it be kind of silly. You had some of it be very serious. There also were people who were interested in the money and the power of music and art already. You know, I mean, this has always been the case. So this would be a way, as you say, to discredit and deflect at the same time, make them look weird. The very first examples of hippies were called freaks, and they were dancing like epileptic seizures on dance floors when the bands couldn't even play their instruments yet, because they were fake, shall we say, put together bands. Okay, this is what Dave McGowan really exposes this again and again and again, stuff that you never knew. these guys, these gals, they were often young, nubile people. They seem to have almost been kept by drugs and wanting to dance and looking weird, and in a way linked to, and they were often being, you said laid, I was going to use the F word, by the leader, okay? There were these charismatic, they called themselves, I'm Dr. Wood, I'm the fuck man, I'm whatever, and they were running basically little bevies of teens, runaways and others. They would bring them to these clubs on the Sunset Strip that hadn't existed, many of these clubs, or hadn't been refurbished until just a month before suddenly these bands are available. Okay? And all of this stuff is interlinked, and it would discredit, as you say, normal, articulate behavior. It makes people look strange, and it doesn't mean that every person who later gets called a hippie by people in the 80s was part of the op. Those are normal people, but it does make them look odd and act odd and behave odd, and then by the end, there's also so much crime around it and other operations like the killings that discredit them further as if they're going to turn violent. When all of that didn't really work, see, I don't think it really worked in a way. In a way, it didn't work. Then Nixon abolishes the draft and it deflates it. So, you know what I'm saying? That just because there was this attempt, it seems, to deflect people's sentiment and control such a movement, control a movement that they knew would happen anyway, it doesn't mean it worked very well, right? But it's there, dancing around in groves versus being out on somewhere and protesting. And he exposes this again and again and again, and it's really something. It doesn't mean the music isn't sometimes wonderful. It's far better than some of the stuff today. But it does mean that there is an attempt, a concerted attempt to make it about California and love and peace, and not about any kind of actual directed anti-status quo that is active, politically active. Do you understand what I mean?
Yeah, I think so. Go ahead.
So if this is going on, and now that's the U.S., but it also was taking place in London. Why? London had maneuvered the U.S., too, to be involved in that war. There were elements in London who you've now gotten, you're talking about the Rothschild family recently. They're, of course, not the only one, but wherever they are, watch out, because things might happen. But there's all kinds of elements through London, old money, old power, and a lot of persons in the U.S. who want to push some agenda for their own group, also tend to be elitists to some degree and link up with elitists in England. So there's old powers in Europe, and some people like to emphasize the church or elements in that. And I mean, there's all kinds of persons who may be involved. But London is a power center for these old cults and so on. And one of the main ones that came out of London was an agent who believed in his own stuff as well, and his name was Aleister Crowley. And he considered himself a black magician. He wanted to bring in an age of war. He thought he was talking to spirits that had told him these things. And a lot of his work, his writings, are about drugs, licentiousness, even human sacrifice, power, magic, and various mind tricks to make yourself more powerful. And some of them are just great techniques. I mean, if you want to get a little bit more control over what you're doing, if you practice using both hands, or you practice speaking backwards, or you practice listening to things backwards, or, you actually do expand your mind. You don't even need drugs. I mean, you're just making yourself smarter in how you're handling things, right? Some of this stuff isn't, it's not that weird. It's bright people do these things, but it was picked up in the 60s, and 20 years before Sgt. Pepper came out, he died. So when they sang 20 years ago today, and they have Crowley on their album, the Beatles were referencing Crowley. Why the sudden interest in Crowley? Well, if Sir Paul was interested, and we know that he is interested in Crowley, there's several testimonies that he's very interested in that man, well, then, even if it's the love and light side of Crowley, just personal power, magic, beauty, and controlling the world for good, he's into it. And the minute you're into that stuff, there's other people around you, even if you're yourself fairly positive. However, there's indications he's not all positive, okay? If he benefited from a death, possibly a murder, fairly quickly, and he's connected to intel, he might be against certain things like anti-war. He might see it as more do your duty and be peace and love, right? Be peace and love, but do your duty for your country. And that's the kind of thing that Papa John Phillips and Frank Zappa and other people in the U.S. were like. They were actually fairly controlling. They were really quite against the hippie thing, but they were there doing it and benefiting from it for their own personal drug and sexual tastes as well. And so if we look more sinisterly at Sir Paul, it doesn't mean he's all bad all the time or he didn't want to help at all for sweet stuff. But within a year of his coming into the band, if he's a replacement, he's suddenly using the McCartney name to be part of the Monterey Music Festival, which promoted major Laurel Canyon bands in the U.S. He's working heavily with the people over there, and they promoted LSD very highly. You know, they had thousands of tabs of acid that were given out, even though it had just become illegal. This has to have been okayed at top levels, right? So why is this? Is he just thinking it's great? Maybe, maybe he likes acid. Maybe he thinks it does turn you on and make you feel neat. But it also is clearly part of a general operation because it's never been prosecuted. None of these people has ever been prosecuted and so on, right? If it were real, going against what the people wished at the time in the U.S. or in London, it would have been far more prosecuted. There were, of course, police that went against these things, right? But it's not. They're not just untouchable because they're famous, right? Certain actions have to have been okayed. So my point is that there's a huge motivation to get a spook, a spy of some kind, a willing cult interested guy into the Beatles. There are two things that begin to get creepy about their music after. There's lots of neat things in their music. But after Paul died, or seems to have died, there are two things. One is the grief. The grief and the gross references to death, very specific references to death, are due to Paul's death. Okay? Those begin coming in, and that already kind of puts a negative in. That breaks up the coherence of the band, and it puts in something that's, of course, a little bit creepy. Just by the nature of when you lose someone, you're going to end up, that's going to now affect what you do artistically. But the other thing is things like Helter Skelter and Maxwell's Silver Hammer, which, although Maxwell's Silver Hammer is supposedly lighthearted, it's brutal. It's about brutal murder, and it's bang, bang, he's dead, and it's all it's about. And Helter Skelter, of course, is gritty, and he said, oh yeah, we worked really hard in the studio to get it as gritty as possible. Are those indications that he has other interests, right? You see what I'm saying? You begin to find things that might on their own not be, but in context they could indicate a psychology that is more split about the peace and love ideal in him, not so much in the others. George and John, of course, and Ringo remained fairly into, peace and love, and John got involved in anti-war later. But Sir Paul never really did. He spoke about being against harming black people, and of course later he got involved in animals and landmines issues, and he did speak out about the Irish. That's something that he did do, and that bucked the system in England. But he did not speak out really about the major warmongering of his day. Do you understand what I'm saying? There's something a little odd about that.
Yes.
And this is again, it doesn't prove he's a double. What it does is say, if he is one, where would we expect to find indications? Well, we'd expect to find them in these sorts of ways. So I wouldn't mind moving on more to the evidentiary nature of things.
Yes, let me ask a question.
Sure.
Didn't Paul as opposed to Sir Paul, extend an offer to write a song that was going to promote the anti-war movement, the peace movement, that was not actually carried out, but that was something he offered to do?
Well, there is indication that from Mark Lane, who wrote A Rush to Judgment, which I think to this day remains a wonderful book of intro to that case about Kennedy's death, that he goes through all kinds of things that weren't known by the average public that about Oswald's situation and what was going on that day. He'd written that in '66 in the U.S., and manuscript forms of it were going around the circles of people connected to people who were connected. And Paul McCartney got a copy in early '66, and he met Mark Lane, and he called him up, and he said, "Hi, it's Paul." So he couldn't have done it. And Mark Lane said, "What? Sorry, who is this? And who couldn't have done what?" Right? And he's got a lot of lawyer cases. And he said, Paul McCartney of the Beatles, I met you at the party. Oswald couldn't have done it. I read your manuscript. And they became fast friends through '66 until he died. And the book came out in August '66, and Paul offered, according to Mark Lane, to write a screenplay, write music for if he ever did a movie. Now, is it Paul or Sir Paul who's offering to write that screenplay? That's uncertain. If it was Sir Paul and was squashed, well, then Sir Paul was more cool than we think. I have a feeling it was probably Paul. He was the one who was making friends with Mark Lane. And Mark Lane, or maybe Sir Paul was on the phone pretending to be Paul and acting like he would, and then he knew that it wouldn't fly, and they squashed the idea through.
I'd be more inclined to think it was Paul calling sincerely, and that might have been one of the reasons for taking him out, not wanting to give his kind of support and energy to the JFK research movement.
That's more likely, but it's not clear from Mark Lane which date it was offered on. But anyway, Paul himself had become very involved with Mark Lane, and it is one reason that there would have been, let's say, extra pressure to get an infiltrator in there. But as I say, there are so many reasons to take him out. So let's sort of talk about from the point of view of how could you be fooled? Just for a second, what would fool you? Well, if somebody's a little different all over, they're not the same person. So you might not notice it if a cheek might be the same, but only in that angle. A nose is the same there, but it's not the same in that angle, and so on, and so on, and so on. So it's actually different, but there's always something similar in any photograph. Or he mimics his voice style. Very early, he tries to pause a lot and speak very pausingly, and he almost does Paul's voice pretty well. After that, he doesn't bother so much. They also had a voice technology that could stretch a voice out a bit and make it sound a little bit more like another. And after a while, you wouldn't need any of that because now he's supposedly just aged, right? Once the first setup is done, there doesn't need to be as much effort put into the cover-up. There does have to be the odd renewing. Certain photos might have to be particularly used with a very stretched lens, which they did for the for the White Album. There were 4 glossies, and the only one that's really weird is Sir Paul's, and he's done with this really close-up, real wide baby face, weird angle. Well, that would still be within a year or two of the real Paul, and it would further make him seem as if he's widely baby-faced, which he isn't, nor was Paul, but he was a little rounder face, a little bit more heart-shaped face. So again, as Peter Jackson said about the Lord of the Rings, if you can do 1 or 2 scenes early and maybe 1 later in the middle that are fairly complex to do, that have split camera and 2 sizes of cups, and Gandalf is shot this way, and and all that. He explains how they did it. Very tricky. Then the rest of it is assumed in the mind quite a lot. You're just assuming he's taller. Then they can use, some dwarfs here and there, but it doesn't have to be the complex early stuff. right after Paul died, or putatively died, immediately, and everyone has noticed this. It's not like, I'm using something they don't know here. The four remaining Beatles start wearing strange costumes. They wear, mustaches. They act strangely. They're not, they claim that people later claimed it was all drugs, right? That it was all drugs that made Sgt. Pepper happen and be weird. However, if Paul died, there's very specific reasons that add into that make it just specifically happen that way, that they would need to make a costume change, make a deflectionary tactic, and so on. That's also where weird things begin to happen in their booklets and so on. It turns from early 60s fanzines into having photos where mustaches are drawn in. You can see the lines. Or there's a photo of the earliest one is George Harrison, I think, in front of or it's one of the early ones, in front of a mirror shaving, and he has no mustache in the real life, but he has one in the mirror. They're already, this immediately begins to be a strangeness in the historical record of the artistic and cryptic aspect in the Beatles. So everything can be explained away simply as a hoax. You can say anything is a hoax. I mean, literally, you could take anything and say, well, that's because of a hoax. You can just decide to disbelieve something. But when you get into the details of this, which I'm hoping to get to, there are some very specific thematics that should shock, that should not be there that specifically if it were a hoax. It does not ring natural with the hoax. Sir Paul is more of a poser type. He tends to move his body in a kind of a, at times sort of, I wish I could do it, but this is radio, so I can't, but sort of,
Slightly affected.
Affected, yes, affected. Now, not all the time.
Yeah.
There's times where he's feeling something. There's times when he's having fun.
But they're slightly not natural. They're slightly self-conscious. They're slightly posy.
Or very, very much, even prissy kind of, For instance, in the Hello Goodbye, where they're playing air guitar, he did not play guitar on film for a year and a half. Okay? If he was learning to get better on the left-handed bass, then that would explain that. Okay? So they're playing air guitar in late 67 for Hello Goodbye. It was his project, and he was really into it, and they're all dancing around the Sgt. Pepper thing. And he's bouncing, but not in the way that Paul bounced. Paul bounced sort of like, because he's into something. This guy is sort of more, as you say, affected, and then, and, very controlled. He just has a different feeling in his body when he's doing certain things. He's just doing. So how could you do this right in people's faces? Well, ironically, as I said, the motivation to have it in the Beatles is really high. So it's actually more likely that somebody would want to do it for that. It's not, okay, so to do all this stuff, and the Beatles. No, it's the opposite, that there would be wish to have this in the Beatles. But also, it can be done in your face because you tend not to believe it. And once, you've bought you sold on it, sort of, you have a new vision of what the guy looks like. You have a new sense. And they are similar at times. I mean, it wouldn't work if they weren't similar.
Claire, this is marvelous. We got to take our second break. This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, with my very special guest today in honor of the forthcoming 9/11, which may also be the observance of the death of Paul McCartney. Clare Kuehn is here. We'll be right back. This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, with Clare Kuehn discussing the thesis that Paul McCartney died apparently in an automobile accident on 9/11, 1966, and was succeeded by someone who, and Clare, this is what I want to ask you, looks strikingly similar and seems to have comparable, even possibly more musical genius than the original. The first time I heard the hypothesis, I thought it was so improbable that there could be two persons who look so very much alike, though I fully grant that with plastic surgery, someone who bore a similar resemblance could be made to look more like him, but more strikingly, that a young man of such musical genius should be succeeded by someone who, by some yardsticks, might have even more. That to me was simply dumbfounding. So I'm fascinated to hear your reflections as you continue and talk about, more specific forms of evidence.
Yeah, I'd like to get this more specific forms of at least the circumstantial evidence. The forensic issues are hard, as I say, they all have things you have to understand specifically about each type of evidence in order to get into them, and it gets very hairy.
Yes.
But I've tried to cover sort of some ways to begin to notice, okay? It's sort of like, but in terms of musical talent, the consensus among those near consensus among those that take this very seriously and believe it, okay, is that Sir Paul is not actually as talented as people have granted him. He's a pretty good rocker. He enjoys music. He probably can read music. He's claimed that his favorite musician is John Cage, who was sort of poser, pretentious, avant-garde artist, the 3 Minutes of Silence and all of that. He's more into that sort of thing. One could say, as somebody said to me, he's just trying to be like John.
But he doesn't sound like a fellow who came from Liverpool who would have that idol.
No, exactly. So even if Paulie, original Paul, wanted to joke, my favorite musician is John Cage. I mean, yeah, maybe, but this fellow, I find his contributions less musically. When I say musical, I don't mean can you put a note together or is there a tune. I mean feelingly coherent. They tend to be refrain-oriented, have one musical idea, and do it for fun repeatedly or getting louder or something like that. There's often, Let It Be, Hey Jude, Oobla-dee-blah-da, that sort of thing. They have a neat musical idea, right? But then they not only repeat it, they repeat it almost without feeling change. Whereas Paul and John, when they were writing songs, there were some very complex ways that those songs develop, even within what is seemingly simple lyrics. The music will shift before the stanza is out. A line will have extra special feeling oomph, such as, beep, 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 yeah. It's not just beep, beep, beep. It's not beep, beep, yeah. It's beep, 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 yeah. It's always this extra little feeling and change in it. That's not true, generally, of Paul. It's more na, 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 right? It's more repetitive, more get bigger. He does seem to have orchestral interests and abilities, so I'm not putting him down entirely. There is musical skill and there's musical interest, but he seems to be more of a polymath who we know he's into Crowley, we know he's into other interests. He's talked about being more of an avant-garde bachelor than John, that he was into listening to records backwards with William Burroughs down in the basement. He's also let slip twice that he had factory jobs before he came to the Beatles. He said he joined the Beatles and already set up a fair, none of which is true of the official life of Paul McCartney. So these sorts of things do come out. So it's not, is he all bad, or do you never like, Band on the Run? It's kind of catchy. But it is more repetitive. It doesn't just repeat words, it repeats musically, it repeats emotionally. There tends to be more of that. Unless he's doing a pastiche. When he does Honey Pie, it's utterly brilliant. It's a brilliant pastiche of the 30s, 40s music. Also his song, Back in the USSR, which is partly a pastiche of the Beach Boys. That's brilliant. I think when he has something to work off, he raises. Then other stuff is, beyond insipid. It's not Paul doing a simple song like, there were bells on the hills, and it's not just a simple but loving song done feelingly. He does insipid songs. So people have noticed differences. The issue is what to attribute them to. That's the key. You've probably noted that Sergeant Pepper was a major shift. You've probably noted that things got a little weird. You've probably noted that they were just at each other's throats towards the end, and there were many reasons for that. But could this be a constant factor in it? Is this something that began to affect why he looks a little different, or there's things that change? And okay, that's where the Paul is dead people have an opening. And an opening is not a proof. But it is an opening. It means the stuff is there. Have we been interpreting it incorrectly? And that's what I'm trying to say to people. If you say, everybody came out tomorrow and told you that this had happened, those would be some of the things you'd go, oh, yeah, well, I always kind of noticed that. I thought it was just the drugs, but now I can see. You see what I'm saying? Or they said that it didn't happen. Well, that must have been the lie, because at other times they joked supposedly that it did happen, but that must have been the truth. So some things in the case are a matter of flip-flop. Some things in the case are the if it's true, there are things that were said. There are things you've noticed that are different. And you interpreted them incorrectly if this hypothesis is correct. It is not that there's nothing there and it's all new to you. But there will be some things that are new. So let's get to some of the stuff that people may not know about the evidentiary material in more detail, to say this should not be there that way in those details if it were made up. Because that's sort of where you begin to clinch it or to push people to say, yeah, it's more likely true.
Yes. Go for the forensic, Claire, if you'd like. I think that's fascinating stuff by these Italian students of the question.
Well, as I said, I sort of was trying to stay away from the forensic issues because there were two Italian forensic scientists. Well, one was a forensic scientist, photo analyst, and the other one was a computer assist forensic analyst, and they took what they say were very good types of photos. They're frontal, they're consistent sort of a lens, approach to the face, right? They line up the eyes, and they say these are roughly the same height. Now, what has changed? And they do an analysis on it, and they find increasing differences, and then they go more and more and more photos. But the problem with that, though it is possibly a proof, the problem with that is that as you're looking at it, if you have the wrong idea in your own head while you're having the explanations given to you, you have your own belief coming in the way and going, well, I don't see the difference, or they just picked the wrong photos. And when you do show people very different photos, something where Sir Paul is caught with the lighting a certain way that really couldn't have come from the same head, okay? Then they say, well, that just might have been a weird camera angle and, maybe a lighting. And they don't understand that this is fairly consistent. You can take the very outlying examples, let's say of Jim Fetzer, where he's in a mugshot, right? And it doesn't look like him. And you can take his regular shots, and you can see the transition from that head, right? You can see, okay, that's an odd angle for that guy, right? When you take my head, let's say, or a little more similar to you, okay, and you do that and you find my outlying examples, our outlying examples will be more different. Right? They will increasingly be different, not be sort of similar outlying examples. It's another way to see it. So I try to stay away from the forensics because it's those are the ways to know it. That's how to know it isn't likely camera. You don't take just one, but you do take outlying examples and say, can this and that come from the same head? Can that and that come from the same head? Not where they have some similarity. And when they do have some similarity, does this one that, have some of the things that were in that strange example over there and cross it over? Does that one have some in the strange example over there? No, they don't. There's a break. There's two guys, but, this is how to begin seeing it. The other thing is DNA, for fingerprints, all of that has been taken away. There's no fingerprints on record. Any DNA that you would want to get would have to go through some kind of chain of custody or nobody would believe it. The only time when we've had that is in a court case about a woman whose mother claimed that she'd had the daughter by Paul in Hamburg in the early 60s. She trotted out lines of people who said, she was a virgin, she was only hanging out with Paul, she was so into him. And then this blood sample comes back, and oops, it's not Paul. And she was so outraged, she said that it must have been, they submitted a false one. He doesn't want to acknowledge paternity. The difficulty with that, of course, is it wasn't compared to a control from the known McCartney family. And I don't mean Sir Paul's kids. That wouldn't matter. I'm talking somebody at the level, up in a second cousin or the brother or anything. None of that was done because it was assumed it was the mother and the daughter versus a real Paul. So he'd only have to submit his real blood, and it wouldn't match them. So it's not a proof that we can say certain that came out that he wasn't. But again, it's one of these lacunae or gaps where that very well may be the DNA indicator you were looking for, but because there wasn't a control, it can't be formally argued that it wasn't his DNA or whatever. So, that maybe she just isn't his daughter and he is Paul. But it, of course, I can see the difference. He didn't have to submit somebody else's DNA, but that was their assumption, was that he'd done that. So the only forensics that are available to test that would be not confusing you while you're reading about them. That's the problem with visuals. The visual is staring at you while you're trying to understand an argument, telling you that it isn't what you're seeing, what you think you're seeing, is voice print analysis. Voice print analysis was done on the songs in 1970 by a fellow in Florida University named Dr. Henry Truby. He did it on the songs. We do not have his write-up. It's not peer reviewable, therefore. We don't know what he tested, what he didn't, and what he controlled for, such as if he controlled for any kind of voice morphing or anything like that. Plus, it turns out, I found out that for court or any kind of voice print analysis, songs are not protocol. There's no protocol to doing a singing voice for formal court testing. So if that's true, you'd need to do it on spoken word samples. Now, the nice thing is that there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of spoken word samples on all different sorts of media, right, for Paul and putatively Sir Paul. And they're in the public record. Now, are they perfect? No. Do we have the original broadcast? No. But if you found a consistent difference across all of the ones after 67 and all the ones before, and then found, cleaned up the best examples and did your formal, more extensive tests on those, you would have a proof. Now, again, no forensic, let me tell the audience, no forensic proof is absolute, okay? And you make this point, too, and I'm going to make it right here, right now. Some people would want to say, oh, the voice technology just did it, or oh, the person did the cleaning up wrong, or everything changed after 67, so it's due to technical differences in it, right? You can explain away any forensic evidence, any piece of real world evidence, because it's not math. Only in math, you set it up and you say, I agree that 1 is going to mean this, and I agree that plus 1 is going to mean this, and I agree that equals is going to mean this. Then you can make an argument 1 plus 1 equals 2. If you do not agree on the terms and you do not agree on the method, you do not have a mathematical proof. And that's what happens in real life. So even if I say we could do the voice print analysis and I submit it would prove that they're different, there would be those that have these other objections. But it would be, again, a very strong indication in a complex set of indications that he's not the same person. And at that point, it's getting unfair. I mean, you're ad hocing, you're saying, well, that one might not be true, and that one might be. And the jury has to say, yeah, either all the forensics and all of the circumstantial case are wrong, or he died. And actually, at that point, because of what I was going to get into next, I think it will be stronger that he died, even if you don't see the difference and can't really tell the body language and stuff. So there's so many indications that he's a different person, and there's so many reasons to have the replacement that, I'm trying to say to people, it's not that outre an idea. There are some people who go, I don't want to pick anybody off, but go too far, and they look at impressions of other Beatles and other people and say they were replaced too. That's occurring because, of course, once you ask one question, you tend to ask them all, and you and I know that people have levied that against us about Sandy Hook and Boston coming from Kennedy and 9/11, that, well, you can't go there. I mean, that's too much. Well, so I'm saying that, though, is true about the idea that other Beatles were replaced. There are counter-arguments that are very strong that they were not replaced, but Paul is consistently has this argument. So if I may get into the other sorts of evidence than forensic for the moment, I hope I've given a sense of what's out there.
Yeah, I'll suggest we come back to it, but later. Go right ahead with what you have in mind now.
Okay, so basically we would have to, if we had people on the podium, right, we would have to go back and notice, well, did the Beatles say anything? How would they say something? Did they artistically express it? In what very specific ways would we not expect them to do it if it's a hoax? How did the hoax or rumor hoax, again, people assume it's a hoax, but it's technically only a rumor. We have to determine whether it's a hoax or real. That's an explanatory issue. But there was a rumor, and the rumor is usually rumored to have started in the U.S. in 1969, but it didn't. Now, first of all, about the U.S. portion, the two people who brought it to public awareness basically got it on the map. Were students. One was a student who wrote a little narrative, wrote a little argument about, if I look here, I find all these weird clues. And he said, I made it up. But then he explained years later what he meant was, I made up my particular form. I went in and I thought maybe this fit and that fit, So he was guessing with less knowledge, but he was putting in some of the clue structures that remain over time. And he wrote this article, and that was in the summer of '69. And it got a little buzz on the campus going, it's kind of weird. Another person at another campus who didn't know him, right, called in, I think it was in October or September, to, I think it was a Detroit radio station. And Detroit, New York, were the big music things until the Laurel Canyon fake scene was set up out in California. He calls in and he goes, hey, man, I don't know what this Paul's death thing is, but I've been hearing it. And the DJ goes, well, that's silly. I don't know what you're talking about. He says, well, stuff like if you play Revolution 9 backwards, listen to it, man. And he does. A backward record, never heard of that. And when you do 13 times, which is occultic and it's also bad luck to general superstitious people, John says at the beginning, number 9, number 9, number 9. And backwards, it sounds like, without the T really, it sounds like, earn me on, Deadman. So it's earn me on, Deadman, earn me on, Deadman, earn me on, Deadman. It's almost turn me on, Deadman, but it's a little bit foreshortened at the end there. And the fellow nearly fell off his chair and said, my God, that's weird. Right? Now, the early persons who heard of this stuff, backwards clues and things in records, and hadn't heard that Paul had died, a lot of them were shocked. So we have to remember that though we may have heard of this now and we have it all fine and feels all nice and we've made it all okay for ourselves, a lot of people were shocked at the time. It was striking. If you allow it to be striking, it's fairly shocking. Nobody knew that this could be done, or nobody was thinking about it, but they were not knowing this. The students who brought this up were also shocked. They'd heard it from bands who'd come to stay, friends who knew bands who'd come to stay, even people from London. And they said, we didn't make this up. We hadn't heard of this. We heard it from, okay. So what seems to happen, even if you know that, is that it's likely that it crossed over from somewhere else. And it was getting into our public history record only in late '69. Then it became a worldwide phenomenon because Sir Paul had been up in his cottage in Scotland for a few months, and then people said, maybe he just died. But the clues went back several years, or the things that people thought were clues were items of grief and grisly references. So then they went through a series of denials, and all kinds of things happened, and then supposedly it died down and it was seen as ridiculous and so on by a lot of people. Some people realized that this was too extensive and they said, I knew something was up. And other people dismissed it, dropped it. Now, in '71, John was in late 70, 71. John Lennon was approached by a young collector and a DJ friend to let this young collector meet him. He let him meet him. He was impressed by the guy. Guy sort of lied to get his way in and said he had special stuff that John couldn't get, which isn't true. And by the end, John was so charmed that he said, "Would you like something?" And the fellow said, "Yeah, I want a Butcher album because they're fairly worth a lot." And John said, "Okay, I got one for you." And he had somebody go to his other apartment, and they had these expensive apartments in the Dakota, and pull out a very specific Butcher album. And this very specific Butcher album had been severed on the top few edges, had been folded back, okay, so that the front was now touching the back. And it was a blank-backed Butcher album, which only a few people got. It was an early press thing. Of course, John would have one. So it's very valuable just in terms of this physical object. But on the back, and then on the front, he signed his name, John, with a little, cloud, and handed it to him. But on the back was a drawing. And the drawing is a very grisly representation of a dead body. It is fixed up, cleaned up, a little bit more perfected. It has indications of things that would occur after a death, such as digging a grave, and it has indications of hope for comfort of the dead person by having a little dog licking out of its hand. But it is a dead man. And so I would like to start with that and then move to the Beatles' clues that go back before 69, because this drawing anchors a lot of the clues into an even more literal representation. You can see it as a prototypical image. And if Paul died and John was expressing that death in this drawing to himself and folding the cover back and making it into almost a little diary Bible, sort of hiding the image. So the Butcher image on the right and the dead fellow with beetle boots on is a sad little fellow on the left, that would be a personal little diary. It would be the most personal testament that we would have from any of them that this occurred. And it helps us make sense of some of the other clues. So if I may do that.
Well, wait one. Was John aware when he gave him this that it had that drawing?
Well, I am, of course, can I read minds? No, but on the other level, of course he was. He was sneaking it out. It's the only way to get this out, right? That would be what I would posit. He said somebody somewhere someday just might get it if I give this out. It probably also got rid of a little bit of his demons. If he'd drawn this to exorcise his memory of the dead body, but also put Paul together again like a Humpty Dumpty Eggman, right?
Yeah.
Then it's a vision of his hopes for the fellow's resurrection. It's also a bit of a memory of the condition of the body in salient features, but it's not completely grisly. He's not drawn in the death throe. He's drawn with the injuries, with the major injuries.
And Claire, of course, you have a copy of the sketch on your website. We're going to continue after our final break. This is Jim Fetzer, your host, with my special guest today, Clare Kuehn, talking about the thesis that Paul McCartney died in 1966 and was replaced by another talented but not equally brilliant musician. We'll be right back. This is Jim Fetzer completing my conversation with Clare Kuehn. Clare, I got to say, I think you've done a fascinating job of laying this out. I know there are those who are going to want to go further with the forensics, and the forensics are so visual that they're really difficult to discuss. But let me mention one site, namely Forensic Science Proves Paul McCartney was replaced at plasticmecca.blogspot.com, which is fairly easy to locate. And would you recommend any others?
Yes, and that's Plastic Macca, M-A-C-C-A, at .blogspot.com. I've put, somebody posted a link giving me a compliment for my broadcasts and work, and they posted it at a forum which has a real mixed bag of good and bad thinkers on it, but they posted it. They did a thread called Clare Kuehn Research on Is Paul Dead? That's the title of the thread. They put that in quotation marks. And it's at Paul was replaced, nothing is real. That's the forum, but I'll give you the actual address. Invanddis, that's INVANDDIS .proboards.com. So if you do, quote, Clare Kuehn, C-L-A-R-E, there's no I, C-L-A-R-E, K-U-E-H-N, as in Nancy, K-U-E-H-N, research on is Paul dead, put that in quotation marks, and then do INVANDDIS, you'll probably get it, okay? And it's a thread in the forum, and about halfway down the first page, I've done a post because the others put some of my other broadcasts on, and they're not all as concise. They're with different interviewers. But I've put a post which has the drawing. It has my blog site listed. It has the 3 interviews you and I have done. It also has a little bit of a summary about the drawing, and it has the link to the interview that you and I did on John Lennon's death.
Mention your blog site right now, Claire, lest that we run out of time. Tell us.
Okay, it's You Can Know Sometimes.
You can know sometimes.com.
Yes. Blogspot.com.
Oh, you can know sometimes.blogspot.com. Good.
Yes, and at the top there's a linked page to it's one of those
good.
where you can set a tab and you can actually go directly to the Paul page. Now, just so that people know, if you print it out, just to tell you the length of it, it's about 400 to 500 printed pages, this one post. It has a lot of images, and it's also got a lot of repeated problematic sections in it because it was being edited when it started to stop allowing me to edit. So I actually have to rewrite the darn thing. In order to go through there, you're going to have to be patient, you're going to have to take time, but all the major pieces are in there somewhere, along with arguments that show what the debunker types would want to say about something and what the Paul is dead types would be saying about it, so that you can judge an entire argument, but unfortunately it's a little broken up. The drawing is in there, but it's also I'd like to talk about the drawing, okay? Because the drawing
Go.
Okay. This drawing, if it was done of Paul dead by John Lennon at some point near to when the death happened, would be an exorcism of that horror of what he saw. Now, it also would be probably a hope that the dead man would be resurrected or have comfort in heaven. It also would probably conflate different time periods, such as John's own memory of attending a funeral or, digging a grave, and so on. Okay? Now, that's what it actually has in the drawing. It has a comforting little doggy. It's got a man who's standing, but he's obviously dead. So it's a zombie, but it's not. It's a visionary image, shall we say? It's a composite image. The body is standing there, frontal. That doesn't mean that's how he would have been found. Okay, it has heavy damage to the head and to the feet, ankles, and shoes. Now, of course, if somebody died and they had a little bit of damage to their pancreas, it wouldn't necessarily be what you'd note if they also had two-way head wounds and broken ankles, right? So he's representing major injuries. Now let's pull back and say that it isn't Paul for the moment, or that it isn't a dead guy, because there are people that just can't see that. So let me take people through what is in there so that it isn't just Claire is thinking she sees it, but I don't see it. There is a dark area up over the head. The dark area is often people who just take a cursory look, say, oh, I guess it's a hat. There are people who've called it a Santa hat, a fool's hat. First of all, fool's hats actually have points that go up and out, okay? But anyway, this doesn't. It has sort of a kind of a splattery look. And also Santa-type hats or elf hats have points that go up along the brim. This doesn't have that, but I'm going to stay away from the top part of the head injury now that I've raised it. I'm just going to leave it there for the moment and say we have to go to the left side of the figure. So that means our right, there, the figure's own left. There is a huge gap on his left eye, beside his left eye, at the temple to ear region. And there's a bit of gore dribble that is coming down like a flap of skin or ear that is hanging there. There are dots at various points in the face, clearly blood spatter or something like that. So there's this huge gap that's over by the left eye, and the left eye is up higher than the right. And also the forehead begins to curve up away from the center, the upper nose bridge, and up towards this gap. So that means there's a gap in the guy's head on his left side. Well, clearly that's a major injury. Okay. So now that I've anchored it for people to say this is a seriously injured person, now we can go back to supposedly it's just a Santa's elf, or, and say that is not likely to be the right interpretation here. Okay? The eyes are wonky, and I want to get to that in a moment, but the center, what does happen when you have a sideways head injury, sometimes your forehead bone will shift, and it will tend to shift to one side up away from the impact until it settles in later, and cut your temple and near your ear. Okay? So that is the kind of injury that we have here. Now, maybe he was also cut in other ways at that temple, but it does show that the forehead is making its way up and away, starting at the upper nose bridge and dislocating the figure's left eye on our right side. Now, what does happen in a frontal bone movement, which is called frontal bone, it's your forehead, it's one big bone right across your forehead, is actually, it's also the top of your eyeball sockets. So any movement to that bone will actually tend to dislocate your eyes, right? That will also occur. Does that make sense? Because it's pulling up on the support.
Yes.
The support is going on. Okay. So he has a gap to his left. He has a dislocated eyeball, and it's smaller up on the left side. His left side. His right eyeball is larger, swollen, popped out, something like that. The eyelids are drawn, and some people would like to say that's just like a Sesame Street character. They put felt, sort of an upper and lower eyelid. Well, it is a simplified drawing, but it's not a doodle. Okay, this is the other word that you do. It's a doodle. It's a drawing. It doesn't matter. It's just a drawing. Any kind of drawing, diary entry, songwriting. I mean, if your grandmother died, you're likely to express it in some way. Let's say, if you're close, okay? And this is an artistic person who draws. Now, people have said he will draw anything, anywhere, and that's, again, this is my point about evidence. If they came out tomorrow and said, we did this would be the strongest piece of evidence of a single nature in the circumstantial case, because what it actually says is, well, gosh, he drew him dead, and he drew him accurately. There's an accuracy to the forensics of this drawing. And also, it's atypical. It's not his typical drawing. He doesn't normally draw like this. In fact, some people have said, I've seen everything John Lennon drew, and like this isn't in the compendia. Yes, it's in a collector's work. He put it up on his website some years ago, and it's back down. The album itself and the drawing have been written about twice in Rolling Stone and elsewhere, because the first collector got the top of the head has jiggity-jaggies. What most people want to read it as the bottom of the dark matter as a hat has jiggity-jaggies, but it's also, in fact, in this case, more likely to be a diagrammatic, metaphoric representation of a broken top half of the head. If you don't know how to exactly draw a brokenness, or it's going to look just like a forehead because it was fallen back, you might put a jiggity-jaggedy to say this is like a broken egg up there. Okay, so it's sort of, you do an eggshell. It's also a fairly flat top line of jig-jags. They're aligned, they just go up. So flat top, Eggman, Juju eyeballs, okay, these things from songs begin to come in, all right? Now, you also have a big jiggity-jag on the figure's right side coming up from his head. Well, parietal bones, which are on the back side part of your head like a vault, they tend to go up and out and crack, okay? And they tend to hang out or hang, if you fall onto the ground or you're shot or something, you tend to fall down and out away from the head. So he's drawn that also on the right side. Imaging this as a person, therefore, whose head may have been, in fact, lying on its side or flipped to its side, but who is now facing you, standing there as a vision from on his way to heaven, okay, to be perfected, these sorts of things make sense about the drawing. Now, the rest of the body, including the lower half of the face and the mouth, are not grisly, okay? Probably, if he's drawing his friend dead. He didn't want it to look absolutely horrible every time he looked at it, but he did want the major injuries in there because that makes you feel like you've expressed them. But the rest of the body's kind of cute. It's kind of stiff, no pun intended, holding a shovel, has dirt under him, grave-like impression. The dog on his left side. And then down towards his feet are what seem to be broken ankles. Now, again, people say, well, you don't have John telling you chapter, line, and verse to interpret his drawing. But what people are very confused about since the early 20th century is that you can know things from drawings. There is no reason you can't know things from most drawings. If the drawing is fairly specific and he's got a huge gash on the side of his head, it might be worthwhile to look at the rest of it from that point of view and say, we're dealing with somebody seriously injured or dead. The dark matter, of course, then would be the brain and blood splatter, okay? Now, the ankles seem to be broken. There are loops for the legs, and they do not connect with the boots, but the boots come up and connect. So he's drawn loops. Now, did he make the legs too short? And he just drew the possible. But one of the things that often happens if you are run over or even if you're shot and you just fall running is your ankles can break or your wrists can break. They're very easy broken, right? So even if you weren't pulled out with no feet out of a car or something, it's very possible his ankles could have been broken if he was hit. It also would be more likely to guarantee a death if you're not in a car necessarily, but you're being run over. You're lured to a rendezvous. This is a possibility. This is sort of the murder idea. Or he might have been put back into a car, and then the car was run somewhere and a fire started. So he may or may not have been murdered elsewhere or something. This is aside from proving that he was murdered. I'm just saying if he were murdered. The feet are disheveled. The shoes are disheveled. The shoes are little Beatle boot type boots. The Beatles wore special dark boots for the early 60s. They had little Cuban heels and zippers or buttons. He's drawn very carefully the little buttons or the little zippers, and they're very disheveled. What I want to make a note about this is that, of course, it doesn't say, hi, this is Paul Dad. I saw the photo on this day, signed John Lennon, affidavit out of court. Okay, that's not what it is. But what it does do is it actually functions as a very poignant and carefully drawn, wherever there were injuries, it's very carefully drawn. So there's very few lines used. It's like he's thinking it through and saying, well, I don't really know how to draw that, so I'll do that diagrammatically, like that's an eggshell. But this part I'm going to kind of draw little dots of gore. But in the middle of the body, it's a little bit shakier. I think if you've ever drawn something, you don't quite know how to draw it well because you're not that good, right? You're struggling, and the parts of it become awkward, but where you really, really want to make sure that there's some detail, you spend more time on it. You make sure that that's a little more careful, and that happens on the feet and the head. Now, so anyway, the songs, the things on the record albums and other related ideas, the films that they did, they often present problems with the feet and shoes. They present problems with the head and the eyes. Those are the main forensic things that keep cropping up in mentions by the Beatles. There's the song, as Ringo sings, you were in a car crash and you lost your hair, something, top of the head is gone. John sings about a flat top, an Eggman in different songs. He talks about juju eyeballs, but always in circumstances where he's also talking about death and dead people. So, for instance, in Come Together, the most reasonable interpretation of that is it's not sexual, though it sounds kind of funky. He starts the song with shoot me, not sugar. It's shoot me 4 times. He must have been grieving. That would be a Paul Dad interpretation. And then sings, because you can see him doing that in the 70s in his live concert. He's shoot me, shoot me. Okay, now, here come old Flat Top. He come grooving up slowly. Well, dead people do, but, he got juju eyeballs. Well, we've seen very specific eyeballs here. The right one is open and staring, and the left one is up and away and very strained. And so when he goes through monkey finger, which is a bony finger, or the monkey's paw, he talks about Ono sideboard, which is clever. He's a clever guy. But what is an Ono sideboard? Why would Ono be in it? Well, she isn't, if I'm right. It's oh no, sideboard, right? So it's sort of like saying, uh-oh, fender, okay? Something from a car. He also was photographed in front of his own car, pretending to be dead. John did. He also took a stethoscope and was photographed in front of a white beetle with his stethoscope to the ground. That's another indication that he was found on the ground, I think. But anyway, the point is there's always cars and car crashes. So, Oh No, Fender, he's won bag production. Now, Ono and Lennon did something called bagism, where they would put on a big bag and say, you don't have prejudices against me now because all I am is a voice. You can't see me. But a bag production, of course, is also a body bag. Okay? So, Come Together Over Me, Over My Grave. Now, that song is filled with references, as other songs are, Eggman and Dead Matter from a Dead Dog's Eye and so on, and walruses and clues and other things they're mentioning, and you in a car crash. George Harrison sings, we all know Oobla Dee Blah Da, but can you tell me where you are? Well, Oobla Dee Blah Da was a Sir Paul song, right? Life Goes On, but also, can you tell me where you are? Original Paul, Are You in Heaven? Now that's from Harrison's supposedly throwaway song about the chocolates, Savoy truffle. But he talks about when the pain gets too bad, you have to scream, and it's about pain. It's about stuffing away your pain. And then he specifically refers to a Paul song and says, can you tell me where you are? Now, my point isn't that these are exclusive items or you have to say each one is true. We have tons and tons of references to death, car crash, specific things linking Paul, grief, sadness, raging, wishing to die because it's so bad, and so on. This all starts after 66. So the drawing has two reasonable explanations from a Paul point of view. One would be, okay, it's a prototype for the hoax. He drew it out so that they'd all have exact dead body to copy from thereafter, right? Or it's actually his own attempt to exorcise what he saw. Now, John was away that week in Germany. He was known to be away in Germany since about the 15th, I forget what it was, the 5th of September or something. He'd gone up to Germany to prepare for the movie he was going to make in Spain. If Paul died on September 11th, Sunday, and then he heard about it on the Tuesday when Brian Epstein, their manager, flew out a little bit later that week to meet John and Neil Aspinall in Paris as they were making their en route to Spain, and said, by the way, Paul's dead, here's the photographs, okay? Because John wouldn't have been there. He wasn't there. Then I saw a photograph, oh boy, right? In his other song would make sense. Now that other song is ostensibly about a different car crash, but Paul might have been on his mind, okay? Do you understand how it works? It's not specifically saying that this drawing has to prove it, but if he died, it's the strongest indication that we have of literal grief right from his own hand, and in fact it has indications within it that it has to be literal. After that, there's missing shoes, missing heads, cracked heads, drawings of bloody shoes, and so on through the historical record. Well, why? If you're damaged or your ankles are broken, you have a live guy. You can't break his ankles to make an image. So, you represent that the shoes are off, or they're on the side, or they're bloody, or, and so on, okay? There are people who suggest if it's a cover-up, why would they leave all these clues? And I say it's the opposite. If there's a cover-up and it's your dead friend, and you wanted to continue, but it also became an operation, it was protection and all kinds of things, then you're going to want to leave without really telling enough people that they would slam you and publicly get you. You're going to want to actually feel as though you've told. Now, feeling that you've told, this, Jim, psychologically, if you're a little kid. You want to tell that you put the goldfish down the toilet bowl, but you don't want your mom to know. But what you do is you say under your breath, goldfish, right? And you hope she doesn't hear. In fact, you kind of make sure she doesn't, but you got to say it. So you feel psychologically you said it to the ether, to God, or whatever. Meanwhile, there's sort of this titillation of maybe somebody heard me, but it's not really fully for them. It's more for yourself. There would be a wish to express it. There would be a wish to be clever. And ironically, the grossness of the literal telling of aspects of a forensic death in various formats would probably not occur as much if they'd come out with it. If they'd come out with it, then everybody would know roughly how he died, and they could just say, it was a car crash, it's horrible, and they could just get into their grief. But the more it's suppressed, ironically, the more people would tend, if this occurred, to actually need to say again and again with repetition compulsion, like heads, gross, feet, yuck, and, like it's kind of icky, because they haven't really fully said it to their normal audience, which is the public. They would have said it to their friends, but they wouldn't have said it to the normal public, and so it creates kind of a repetition compulsion. Now, there are persons who say, oh, Claire, you just think you're an expert on everything. Now you interpreted a drawing and you're saying it's forensic. And, oh, by the way, now you're talking about psychology. Are you some kind of mind reader expert? This is unfair. Everything I've said is something that any educated person who is trying to be reasonable about a subject where there is a fair number of strange things in it could put together. This is stuff that, you don't have to be a formal expert to understand how children or how yourself, when you lie, what do you tend to feel like you sort of want to tell but you sort of don't, and all that stuff. This is not, you don't have to be an expert, and I am very well read, and I did do some artwork, and I did do some schooling. So this was, the forensic issues were things that I went and researched because with a sideways head injury and a top head injury, I thought, well, what actually happens when somebody gets those injuries, right? And this is because bones tend not to break in the middle. If it's a sideways injury, the front bone is the whole big bone. It would tend to shift up. That is, in fact, roughly what he's drawn. So very possibly that's what the condition was to some degree in the body. The last thing I'd like to mention about the drawing as related to the walrus gumboots, the little, why a walrus? Well, walruses have damage to the mouth, which, they have a dead person with damage to the mouth. Of course, their teeth are showing. Walruses have prominent teeth. He doesn't do that in the drawing, but he may, let's say, not have wanted to make it look too grisly to look at directly for himself. It's still pretty grisly. But anyway, they also have wonky eyeballs, and they have mustaches. And, of course, quite immediately they put a mustache on the replacement. And the dead guy had wonky eyeballs, and there are some images where the mouth is pulled up and it looks pretty gross on the mouth too. So that may be where the walrus image comes from, as a dead guy but also with a mustache. I should also mention about the wonky eyeballs. How much time do we have here?
We're virtually done, so just say it. Okay,
I'll say it. It turns out that there are 4 representations of these wonky eyeballs, and they're all the same. One is a photo of Sir Paul deliberately mimicking. He's making a weird face, pulling his face up and squinching his left eye and pulling his right eye down. There's no context for that photo, but if he is expressing, of course, the dead guy he replaced, this would make sense. There's a flashing image in Day in the Life film, which has a guy with glasses on, and he's got one big open eye on the one glass and one closed eye, left eye on the right glass. That is exactly the same eye condition as John's drawing, and it shows up very early in that film, flashed right at the creepy crescendo, and they're showing that birds are flying like spirits. So, and that song is Day in the Life is about a car crash. So it has the same eye condition. And then in 1996, there's also an image in the back of a police van with no blur when the camera's panning, so it has to be an added image. And that has a leafy-like reflection with a death head, and it also seems to have a right eye open and staring. Left eye is a little bit more normal. The mouth there is pulled up, just as in the Paul photo, and Sir Paul photo. And it's right when they are about to show a 1960s car crash, and it's a video in 1996, Free as a Bird, which is about the history of the Beatles. So my point is, just in that thing about the eyes, if John is drawing a real condition of a body, then that would be the prototype in the mind, not in the drawing, in the mind, would lead to certain exact representations being consistent over years. That it wouldn't just be sort of, I don't know, knives and guns and somebody died metaphor. It would be fairly specific stuff would get repeated.
Claire, you have done a magnificent job. It's virtually breathtaking, and we're going to close out with I Am a Walrus, which I believe everyone will find to have a renewed significance. I can't thank you enough. This is Jim Fetzer.
R.I.P. to both of them, yeah.
This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, thanking Clare Kuehn for being here and all of you for listening.